can recall the hours I spent building this ship model, and I guess it's all part of the love of the sea and part of my desire to go into the Navy during World War II. But I could have been a sailor. I probably could have been an engineer building ships and as part of a career. But the war interrupted all of that. When World War II broke out, there wasn't any question about who was going to support the world and who was going to support our troops, our country. And I immediately enlisted in the Navy. At the time, drafting was still just initiated. And my brother Charles had received his appointment as a postmaster, assistant postmaster there in this little town. So he was exempt from the draft for that purpose. But I had enlisted, and in September of '42. I got immediately on the train and sent to Great Lakes Naval Training Station in Chicago. And the first time only the second time that kid had been out of the state of Indiana. And so they told me there, oh, they won't ever send you to sea, first of all. You can't swim. And they won't send you to sea unless you can swim and swim underwater. And also your teeth are very bad. And it says we'd have to get those fixed. And he says you won't be sent out for probably 4 or 5 months. That lasted about 3 weeks. And all I learned in boot camp was how to swing a hammock and how to roll your clothes and how to march. Didn't march very far, just far enough to eat and come back and go to work. But 4 weeks after I arrived at Great Lakes, I was on a train headed for Norfolk, Virginia. And I was assigned to the John D. Powers old 4-stacker destroyer. And we were escorting tankers up and down the east coast there, from Aruba and Curacao to the refineries around Hatteras and Savannah and so on. And of course, the German U-boats were patrolling down there, and it was a little dicey situation. I was interested in learning how to steer ship, and so I said I want to be a quartermaster. And they says, well, I'm not sure about that. I think you need to be a signalman. They sent me to Naval Signal School at the University of Chicago, and I had 5 weeks of signal training there, and they sent me to Brooklyn to ship out, and at that point in time they were having a lot of problems, serious problems with the convoy work, and so they put me in what was called the Armed Guard, which was the Navy crews aboard merchant ships. And that's what I did for the rest of the war. I rode merchant ships. Some of it was pretty dicey. On our first trip was in the spring of 43. We were headed for Murmansk, Russia, but they had made in their infinite wisdom, they decided to make this run because they needed those supplies so badly in Russia. But it was too late in the or too early in the spring, and daylight lasted until like 10:30 at night, and we were only about 90 miles off the Norwegian coast, which of course was German territory. So we were subjected to strafing and so on from land-based fighters, bombers, and we were struck, and our deck cargo was set on fire, and so we abandoned the convoy. The convoy was dispersed because they were losing lots of ships and lots of people. So they ran us back into Belfast, Ireland, first of all, and we laid there in Belfast, Ireland, while they were doing getting the unloading set up. So we went down to Avonmouth in Wales, and Avonmouth is the port for River Avon, where William Shakespeare was. And we'd take off and to go into London, ride the train, and we walked past Shakespeare's birthplace there in Avonmouth. And then we continued on that particular ship. The ship itself wasn't damaged, but the danger of the fire on the deck caused us to run back in. Now that was the old Chester Valley ship that I was on. That was the first merchant ship. The old Chester Valley was an old ship made in Hog Island, Pennsylvania, and resurrected to serve as a freighter in the war. Well, due to the damage that had occurred when we got it back to the States, they took me off and put me on another ship, another merchant ship, and I'm trying to remember which one of those I was, but I lost that ship. We were torpedoed, and I believe it was in January or February of '43 when I lost the first ship, and then we were picked up by the. We were only in the water maybe no more than 2 hours, but we were picked up by rescue ships of the convoy guard, the escort ships, and then the next ship I was on, we lost her. I believe it was in November of '43, but we suffered a lot of casualties on the second ship. The first one, we went down. We only lost a couple of merchant marine, but we didn't lose any of the Navy crew. And then, but the second one we did suffer quite a number of casualties. But
it must just be unbelievably hard to go through something like that. I'm thinking about the people you knew, and how many of the, you can take a moment, Dad. I was just wondering how many of the armed guard did they put on each of these merchant ships?
There was 26 aboard, 26 Navy personnel aboard with one officer, and there was one signalman, which was me, and there was one radio man, and but all the rest were gunners, and we had 20 millimeters. We had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 20 millimeter guns, and we had a 3-inch 50 cannon on the bow, and a 5-inch 38 cannon on the stern. And the 3-inch 50 was capable of elevation in order to fire an aircraft. The 5-inch 38 on the stern could not be elevated high enough to for any support for aerial. But
what does a signalman do on those boats?
Well, aboard ship, there was radio silence, so there was no radio communication. And so for all of the communication between these ships in the convoy is all done visually. And so we had signal flags that we ran up on halyards to a ridgepole, and these were signals that came from the commodore of the convoy, and with the message there of what the course was to be and when we were to execute and stow, and spacing of ships and that sort of thing. It was information relayed visually by that. Now that was for the entire convoy, and so when the Commodore would send out a message, and we would prepare that and hoist it up, the signals for that, and then when we would watch the Commodore, and when he gave the order to execute, then we'd pull those down, and the ship would turn and do whatever was necessary for it. Then between the ships, we used semaphore flags, personnel flags, where we would spell out the words with the semaphore flags. And the most efficient thing was blinker lights, and we sent everything Morse code by blinker lights. And some of these I can recall having transmitted messages by blinker lights for as far as 15 miles, which was right on the horizon. And but the signalman's duties aboard the Merchant Marine ship, you were on 24-hour duty, and we would stand guard usually during daylight hours because of the flags, but we had to be prepared for signal lights at night, and in that case we used blue lights. The next ship that after I lost the second ship was went aboard the Henry L. Benning, and we made some, I believe, on the Benning, I believe I made 6 round trips across the Atlantic, and we had some dicey times, and particularly in some bad weather. But then I was taken off of that and put aboard the next ship, which we did lose, and we lost her in, I guess, March of '44, in what was termed the return of the wolf pack, where the Germans sent hundreds of subs and surface raiders and so on to prey on the shipping in the north. We got hit on the Benning and damaged our rudder, and we were only 900 miles out of New York at that time, and they brought us in and with seagoing tugs, and got us into Boston. And so I left that ship there. I believe it was the Cromwell, but I'd have to get back into my notes. But it was rather disastrous because we did lose. Of the 26 Navy men aboard, I was one of 8 that survived. And the procedure aboard merchant ships was that the merchant crew utilized the lifeboats. And these lifeboats, 2 of the 4 lifeboats were motor driven. But the Navy crew had rafts. And when we got the order to evacuate ship, it was they had these rafts were on slides, and they would trip the slides and let the rafts hit the water, and they had what was called a sea painter, which was a line that held the raft onto the ship. But it was up to the Navy crew to jump, and jumping in pitch darkness into water that was probably 30 to 40 feet lower than the ship was pretty spooky, particularly for a 19, 20-year-old kid. But we again were we would jump, hit the water, and we had life preservers with signal lights, little red signal lights on it, and it was up to us to swim to the raft. And the raft was each of those was a big ring of balsa wood covered with painted canvas, and suspended from that was a deck with rope hangers to, so we could get inside that ring and stand. We didn't have to keep treading water and so on. But the merchant crew, those that had the motor driven, they would come by and pick us up and put us into their lifeboats, and that was our greatest chance of survival, was for them to pick us up. If we had to wait for the destroyer escorts or the escort vessels to find us and bring us out of the water, was pretty dicey. It didn't survive very long. One of the most difficult things to get over was the sight of one of my Navy shipmates. He was wounded. We were trying to get him into the raft, along with myself and 2 other guys. And we were trying to get him into the raft. And it was freezing cold. And he was lifeless. And we hung on to him probably for an hour, maybe. And then the waves tore him away from us. In the North Atlantic, because of they trying to disrupt all of the trade of all of the Lend-Lease materials and all of the foodstuffs and everything that was needed to get over there. They were trying to interrupt that, whether the ship was loaded or unloaded. Even coming back when we were in what was called dunnage, we were targets, because if they could eliminate a ship, it wouldn't make another trip. on this one trip, we started out from England with 28 ships in the convoy. We got in with 11. The German U-boats would get out ahead of a convoy, and they would submerge and would lay there and wait for the convoy to pass over them. And then they would surface and wouldn't break surface, but they would come up to firing range and fire their torpedoes. And they tried to get in a spot where they could fire across a whole range of 3 or 4 different lines of ships. And the most disconcerting of all was to see tankers torpedoed, where there would be a tremendous explosion, and you know there would never be any survivors. And
did the merchant ships have instrumentation that would warn them of a torpedo coming,
no.
or it just surprises you? It's a total shock when it hits.
Well, yeah, there was even the escort vessels had sonar and some hit and miss radar, but they would get the warnings of any U-boats that were operating with anything that would return a signal, like a motor or like communication. And then they would start firing depth charges. And I have listened to hundreds and hundreds of depth charges being fired.
What kind of stuff goes through your head when you're a kid and you're in the middle of this?
We were invincible. We were kids. We weren't going to get hurt. When we did, it was kind of hard to handle, but it was harder to handle seeing other kids, and these were kids. Probably the oldest one on any of these crews here was maybe 26, maybe 28 years old. Most all of them were volunteers and right out of high school. It was a big relief to be able to get into port and with your buddies go out on the town and thank the Lord that you made it. These are some of my very favorites. Of the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Actually, there's 9 Navy personnel in this photo, and of those, 3 of them didn't make it. After I lost the 3rd ship, some of this information got back into the local papers, and they did a kind of a story of I guess, I was 21 when they, or at least it says it was 21. And let me read this thing to you. It says, shipwrecked 3 times. John Z. Clark, above, age 21, signalman 3rd class in the Navy, son of Mrs. Hazel Clark of Summitville, is home on a 27-day furlough following unusual experiences, including 3 shipwrecks. He has been in service 3 years, during which he was on 4 different vessels. 3 occasions he was on vessels shipwrecked, including 2 destroyers and a Liberty ship. That's wrong. There was only 1 destroyer. He was wounded on 3 occasions during combat duty. He received Purple Heart. Long and momentous career in the Navy. He served both Pacific, Atlantic Ocean. After 27 days at home, he will go to Great Lakes Hospital for treatment before discharge. I didn't realize when that was taken, but I guess the war was over then, and I was on my way back to be discharged.
What kind of treatment did they send
I
you?
had my shoulder was all busted up, and on, I guess the second ship we got, when we got hit, the concussion knocked me off the bridge, and I landed on the deck below, and broke my shoulder up. But of course, there's no doctors aboard, and even the commodore of the convoy was the only one that had a doctor aboard, and that was. So when we got into port, and I went into the hospital, well, they said, well, it started and it back, says, come back after the next trip here, and we'll see about resetting it, maybe re-breaking it. And so when the war was over and I wanted to get something done about it, they sent me to the Naval Hospital at Bethpage there in Maryland. But they would only give me a 50 chance of having use of my fingers and hand, because at that time in 1940 and 45, they did not have the technology of the nerve regeneration and so on. So they had to disconnect those nerves to be able to work that collar, that shoulder bone. But anyway, I lived with it. I wasn't even going to wouldn't even dream of taking that kind of chance, because living with it in the north where the weathers were cold and so on and damp, it did bother me for many years, but it doesn't. But one of the biggest problems that we faced was that we only had one naval officer on board, and this duty was not regarded as combat duty until right at the end of the war. And by that time, most of the people that could verify what happened to these ships and what happened to the guys aboard, that was all missing or gone, didn't need it any longer, so they got rid of it. So a lot of those records went by the wayside. I made it and other guys didn't. And I didn't realize till later on that God was in control. At that time, I didn't recognize it at all. In fact, I didn't recognize it until many years later, when I started reviewing some of the things that happened in my life that made it very obvious that the Lord was in control. And yeah, He had a job for me to do, and I guess the fact that I'm here 88 years later, and I still haven't done everything that I would expect to be able to do. My experience during World War II, some of it was very, very trying, very difficult, but there was also the great side. I was lucky enough, of course, to have been serving in the Armed Guard, which was the merchant ships that traveled did the convoy work and the transportation of all of the materials necessary to Europe. And times were rough, but there was also some great experiences. Being aboard merchant ships, when you pulled in, you were either tied up and you were either unloading or loading. And so there was always the opportunity not only to go ashore and do things, but also to have some time off. But during that time, I made some, I believe it was 14 round trips across the North Atlantic, and also got to include some other trips, like we made the trip to Murmansk, Russia, which was quite an experience, and gave us the opportunity to see the very restrained life that the Russian citizens and the Russian military have, and made us so much more thankful that we've got all the benefits of the democracy that we live in and was in there. Because when we were in Murmansk, when we pulled into the dock before we could go ashore, we had to sign a release saying that we realized that we were under red martial law when we stepped off the ship. We brought our ship back to the States, and we were still in a winterized condition, but they took us immediately into the Mediterranean, where we got into the invasion of Sicily. We came back and reloaded for the Mideast, and so we traveled through the Mediterranean and the Suez Canal, and that was quite an experience, because as the ships go through going one way, they overnight in the Red Sea, the Dead Sea. And it was quite an experience jumping off in that salt water that you can't sink in, and not being able to swim. That made a big difference to me. But then we've traveled on around down to around the Arabian Peninsula and up into the Persian Gulf and up the Tigris River to where we were unloading in the port of Khorramshahr. That was, of course, we knew it then as Persia. Of course, it's been Iran now for a number of years, but the unloading there took quite some time, because they used a native labor. They didn't have all of the mechanical equipment, derricks and booms and lifts and so on. So we were there about unloading about 5 or 6 weeks, and together with a couple of other buddies of mine, we decided we would hitchhike up to Baghdad there in Persia. But some of our military buddies that we ran into convinced us that was the wrong thing to do. We ought to go to Iraq. So the three of us hitchhiked up to Basra there in Iraq, and we spent I think 4 days or so there in Iraq, and had some very noticeable experiences. One that I remember so well was that they had these dance platforms around the village square there in Basra, and they had a small orchestra that played, of course, the native music, but the sheiks and the well-to-do chiefs from the different tribes out in the desert would come in at night, and they would gather around these platforms, and they had dancers. Of course, that was belly dancing type of dancing, but the girls were probably in their late teens or early 20s, and they were very, very talented, and musicians were, for that kind of music, were very good. But these friends, these Australian friends that we had met, there says, boy, you don't ever want to get close to there. You don't even want to show an interest in this dancing or these girls, because that chief or that sheik, they're investing money, they're paying, and whoever pays the most money usually gets to spend time with the dancer. But he says if you interfere in any way, even get up close to the dance platform, the sheik will take care of you. He'll have his people follow you. So it was an experience there, and at that time, Karamshar was about 60 kilometers from the hottest place in the world, where the British had a weather station there since the 1800s, and it never recorded a temperature day or night below 96, with daytime temperatures up in the 140s and 150s. But we left Karamshar there and back down the river over to Pakistan, where we had some deck cargo to be unloaded in there in Karachi. We had a very short period of time there in Karachi because we only had just the deck cargo that we needed to unload there, which was P-3 aircraft and aircraft parts. And from there we were to head to Australia to prepare for the Japanese invasion. So we started out across the Indian Ocean, but then we got the warning that there was a German raider in the Indian Ocean there that was camouflaged as a merchant ship, but was heavily armored and had already sank 4 vessels in there. So they rerouted us over to the East Africa shoreline, and we followed the shoreline down through the Straits of Madagascar and on down to Durban there in South Africa, and overnighted there in Durban, and then on into Cape Town, where we laid up for almost 6 weeks while they de-winterized our ship that had all the insulation and all the all of the changes necessary to do the Murmansk run. We're just now getting that taken off. And so that was a very delightful 6 weeks that we spent there in Cape Town. Got a chance to get out into some of the surrounding jungle and
any adventures you want to tell us about?
Well, we had some great adventures there, most of which I don't want to repeat. But then we found that we received orders to proceed from Cape Town to Buenos Aires, Argentina. Now, Buenos Aires Argentina was a neutral country, but there in the Rio de Plata, the German battleship, the Graf Spee, had cruised in there and had run aground, and the Argentine government interned the entire crew of the Graf Spee. Well, we were there in Buenos Aires loading shelled corn to bring back to the States. And so it took us a little while, and so we enjoyed Buenos Aires, and there was a lot of American industry there in Buenos Aires, and they, since we were the first American ships that had been allowed into Argentina being totally neutral, they had not had the opportunity to see any Americans, particularly military. So it was a little dicey there with the crew of the Graf Spee, which was somewhere around 700 internees. that didn't appreciate that the appearance of American vessels in the harbor there. But we enjoyed it very much. Went from there after loading up. We traveled up to Rio de Janeiro, and we spent a couple of weeks in Rio while they were preparing orders for us back in the States. And also there was an impending hurricane in the Caribbean, and so we then proceeded. Of course, we were running alone then. Mm-hmm. We were no longer convoy protected, so we ran along the coast of Brazil and up through the Windward Islands, and we followed the tail end of the hurricane, and we pulled into New York with a load of corn that was then taken up to Albany and used to manufacture alcohol for the preparation of munitions. But in all that, the ability, the capability, the experiences that I got in traveling while I was traveling aboard merchant ships has been a very lasting thing. And it's not, I love now to be able to go to Google Earth and trace back places that I had gone to. I have even been able to locate the exact dock in Buenos Aires where our ship tied up to do the unloading, and also to visit some of the many places in Europe that I got to visit when I was working there, in Switzerland and Germany and France, and got to spend some time in places like Belgium and Holland, England, a little bit in Italy, but nothing like the like. But what I like to do now, of course, is I'd like to take Peggy back to Europe so that we could go and visit some of the places, and some of those, of course, will not look at all like they did when I was there. But it would be a great thing to be able to take her, to show her some of the things that I had enjoyed many years ago. Then an opportunity came along because of my college and my military service that they contacted me to work with a very obscure and covert operation called subversive criminology.
And this was the military contacted you?
This was, yes.
Was it called like the National Security Administration at that time, or the CIA, or anything like that?
Well, it was controlled by the CIA, but it was a separate division, totally covert. And the principal mission of this was to investigate the activities of prominent and influential personnel in both in the commercial and military world. Their dealings, and a lot of it had to do with the black market work that these people were being investigated for, and coercion, collusion, and so on. And so at that point in time, I had to enlist in the Army to function that way, and it was quite an interesting experience, and one of which I believe somewhere in my records I've got a letter from one of the officials of the department that, of course, they today that they would disclaim all knowledge of anything like that. But it was an experience. I had traveled a lot and investigated a lot of different people for different reasons. Well, during that period of time, my Marjorie got a divorce, and when I found that, I discovered that, I resigned up there and came back to Muncie to start back to college.